The words hit him like a bullet to the chest, and the entire saloon went silent. "I am not worth fighting for." Rosa Mercer stood at the center of the dusty barroom floor, her dark eyes shining with a fierceness that looked terrifyingly close to grief. Her voice steady in the way that only someone who had practiced saying something painful could manage. She was speaking to the man who had grabbed her wrist, a thick, red-faced cattle driver named Hollis Pratt, who had been drinking since noon, and believed that $3 entitled him to something that was not for sale. But the words, Eli Harding understood with a cold clarity that settled deep in his bones, were not really for Hollis Pratt at all. They were for herself. Every head in the Lucky Star Saloon turned. 12 men, maybe 15, all sunburned and trail-worn, all holding their whiskey glasses or their card hands frozen mid-motion, all watching. The piano player, old Chester Hale, had let his fingers fall from the keys without even knowing he had done it. The two painted women by the staircase pressed their backs against the wallpaper. Even the bartender, a man named Rupert who had seen everything this territory had to offer, was holding his breath. And then Eli Harding stood up. He did not do it fast. He did not kick his chair back in dramatic fury or slap his palm to the bar. He rose slowly, deliberately, from the corner table where he had been nursing a single glass of bourbon for the better part of an hour. And when he reached his full height, every man in that room felt the shift in the air the same way you feel the pressure change before a storm rolls in across the mesa. He was not the biggest man in the room. He was not the most obviously dangerous, though the Colt revolver on his hip and the quiet economy of his movements suggested otherwise. He was just a man standing up, and somehow that was the most terrifying thing any of them had seen all evening. "Let her go," Eli said. Hollis Pratt turned, his red face twisting into contempt. "Who in the hell are you?" Eli took one step forward. "The man who is telling you to let her go." Rosa's eyes found his across the room, and something in them fractured, not in a grateful, rescued woman way, but in a raw, unguarded way, like a wound being exposed to air for the first time. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they cannot afford to want. That look would stay with him for months. It would follow him into sleep and out of it. It would change everything. Harlan Creek was not much. It sat in a shallow basin between two ridgelines of red rock, surrounded by scrub juniper and the occasional cottonwood that marked the path of the small seasonal creek that gave the town its name. There was a main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a livery, a barber shop, a church that looked as though it had been built in a hurry and repented of immediately, and the Lucky Star Saloon, which was without question the most substantial building in town, 2 stories, with a proper painted sign and glass windows that had survived the territory's wind, which was saying something. Eli had ridden in from the east, which was all he was willing to say about his origins at the time. He was 28 years old, lean and dark-haired, with a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same red rock as the surrounding landscape, and eyes the color of weathered pine, a gray-green that most people found difficult to read. He had been a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a deputy for one brief and disillusioning winter in a small Texas town, and most recently, a man trying to forget that he had once believed in something and been wrong about it. He took a room at the Lucky Star because the only alternative was a tent, and at 30 cents a night, it seemed like the reasonable choice. He saw Rosa Mercer on his first morning in Harlan Creek. She was carrying a crate of bottled goods from the supply wagon into the back of the saloon, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not waste time or motion, and she did not look at him as he passed her in the side alley. He noticed her the way you notice a fire on a cold morning. Instinctively, involuntarily, because something in the animal part of the brain registers warmth and says there. He did not speak to her that day. He learned her name from Rupert the bartender, who had the sociable habit of narrating the saloon's social landscape to anyone who rented a room and seemed willing to listen. Rosa Mercer, Rupert explained, had been working at the Lucky Star for 2 years. She had come up from a town south of Las Cruces with references from a hotel there and had been hired on as a floor manager of sorts. She kept the accounts, ordered the inventory, managed the 2 women who worked the upper rooms, and generally kept the establishment running in a way that its nominal owner, a distracted man named Gerald Fitch, who spent most of his time in Santa Fe, had apparently never managed on his own. She was not one of the girls upstairs. Rupert made that clear with an almost protective emphasis that told Eli the clarification had been necessary before, and that Rupert had not enjoyed making it. She was employed, she had wages, and she maintained a distance from the customers that was professional and absolute. "Smart woman," Eli said. "Smartest person in this building, including me," Rupert said, with no apparent embarrassment about this admission. Eli thought about that as he drank his bourbon. He watched Rosa move through the saloon that first evening from his corner table, and he thought that Rupert was probably right. She moved through the room with a quality of awareness that reminded him of a good scout, knowing where everyone was without appearing to look, adjusting her path before problems arrived rather than after, keeping everything smoothly ordered in a place that was fundamentally designed for disorder. She was methodical and controlled and entirely composed, and she had the kind of dark eyes that, when they did land on you, felt as though they were reading something written in a language you had never studied. She caught him watching her on that 3rd night. He did not look away. He was not certain why. Maybe he was tired of looking away from things. Maybe something about the way she held herself. The careful, measured pride of a woman who had learned exactly how much space she was permitted and had decided to take slightly more, made him feel that looking away would be a kind of insult to her intelligence. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, and then she moved on, and he returned to his bourbon, and nothing was different except that something was. The dark past that Rosa Mercer carried was not a secret exactly. In a town the size of Harlan Creek, nothing was a secret in the literal sense. But it was a past that people discussed with their eyes rather than their mouths, which amounted to the same practical effect. Rosa knew that they knew. They knew that she knew they knew. And by unspoken agreement, nobody put words to it in her presence. Her father, William Mercer, had been a gambler and a drunk who had run through money with the systematic dedication of a man with a mission. He had died in Harlan Creek 4 years before Rosa arrived, owing debts to half the county and leaving behind only a reputation that followed his daughter like a shadow. In the southern New Mexico territory of 1882, a woman with no money, no family, and a disreputable name had exactly as many options as that description suggested. Rosa had made the most of the options she had. She had worked, and she had saved, and she had kept herself respectable in all the ways the territory defined respectability, and she had built something from nothing with a discipline that Eli came to recognize over the following weeks as a form of armor. He learned all of this not from gossip but from observation, and from the careful, incremental conversations they began to have. It started with the accounts. On his 5th day in Harlan Creek, Eli was in the saloon in the mid-afternoon when Rosa was working through the ledger books at the back table, and he had made some offhand remark about a calculation she was wrestling with. He had a facility with numbers, a gift from nowhere in particular, that had always served him better than he deserved. She had looked at him with the measuring expression he was becoming familiar with, and then she had turned the ledger toward him and said, "Then what do you make of that column?" He had sat down across from her without being invited, and she had not told him to leave, and they had spent 40 minutes working through a billing error that had been causing her quiet frustration for 2 days. When they had solved it, she had closed the ledger and said simply, "Thank you." "Eli Harding," he said, extending his hand. She had looked at the hand for a moment. "Rosa Mercer." She shook it once firmly and returned to her work, and he went back to his bourbon, and the temperature of everything between them had changed in a way that was barely perceptible and entirely real. After that, they talked. Not every day, not always for long, but with a consistency and an honesty that surprised him. She asked direct questions and expected direct answers, which he respected because most people did not do that. Most people circled around what they wanted to know and then felt somehow cheated when they did not get it. She wanted to know where he was from, and he told her Texas. She wanted to know why he had left, and he paused, and she said, "You do not have to tell me," with an equanimity that made him want to tell her more than he had intended. "There was a woman," he said. "I thought she was going to marry me. She married my employer instead, because my employer had land and I had wages. I am not saying she was wrong. I am saying I needed to not be there anymore." Rosa considered this with the same careful attention she gave to her ledger columns. What was she like? "Nothing like you," he said, and he meant it descriptively, not romantically, and yet the moment it was out, they both heard something else in it, and Rosa looked back down at the table, and the subject was dropped, and the air was dense with the things neither of them would say. He had been in Harlan Creek for 3 weeks when he heard the rumors about Gerald Fitch. The owner of the Lucky Star was not, in fact, as distracted and indifferent as Rupert had initially suggested. He was, rather, pursuing a specific plan that he had not shared with his employees. Fitch had agreed in the previous spring to sell the Lucky Star to a land and business speculator from Albuquerque named Carve, and the sale was contingent on the Saloon being delivered in clean financial order and free of. This was the delicate phrasing that Rupert had heard secondhand from Fitch's lawyer, irregular arrangements. Irregular arrangements meant Rosa Mercer. Dunn was old-fashioned in the specific way of men who used old-fashioned values as convenient tools. He did not want a woman managing his accounts or ordering his inventory or generally running his business better than he could. He wanted the Lucky Star to be a saloon, simply and completely, which meant he wanted the girls upstairs and the games and the liquor. And he did not want a woman with a ledger book and opinions about billing who made the other employees look incompetent by comparison. Fitch had written to Rosa, telling her that her position would be restructured once the sale went through, which was a letter writer's way of telling her that she was being dismissed. The letter had arrived 2 weeks before Eli rode into Harlan Creek, and Rosa had read it twice, folded it precisely, and placed it in the locked drawer of her desk, and had not mentioned it to anyone. Eli found out from Chester Hale, the piano player, who had the musical artist's gift for hearing everything, and the musical artist's corresponding difficulty with keeping things to himself. He told Eli about it sideways, in the manner of someone sharing information they believe the listener has a right to, and the subject would prefer they not have. Eli sat with that information for a day. He thought about what it meant. A woman who had built something careful and dignified from difficult materials, facing the loss of it through no fault of her own, through the ordinary machinery of men deciding things about women's lives without consulting the women in question. He thought about the way she looked when she was going through the accounts, the focused, quiet satisfaction of it, and he felt something low and hot in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite something else, but was composed of both. He thought about going to Gerald Fitch, who was due in Harlan Creek within the week, and saying something. He thought about what that would accomplish. He thought about whether Rosa would want him to do it, and concluded with a certainty born of 6 weeks of watching her that she absolutely would not. Instead, he asked her directly. He chose a quiet afternoon, the saloon nearly empty, Rosa at her usual back table. He pulled out the chair across from her without ceremony and said, "I heard about Fitch." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said, "Chester." "Chester," he confirmed. She was quiet. She put her pen down with the kind of care that meant she was deciding something. Then she said, "It was always going to happen. I have been in this territory long enough to know that what I have here is not permanent. Nothing like this is permanent for a woman in my position." "What is your position?" "Practical," she said, with a flatness that was not bitterness but was very close to its less emotional cousin. "I have no family, no property, and a last name that half this county associates with unpaid debts. I have managed to make myself useful, and useful is a thing that can be taken away." "It should not be," he said. "No," she agreed. "It should not be, but the territory does not particularly concern itself with what should be." He looked at her, at the careful, composed architecture of her expression, at the way she was holding herself with a precision that he now understood was not coldness but protection. And he said, without quite planning to, "You could fight it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her eyes moved like water disturbed by a stone. "I have been fighting since I was 19 years old," she said quietly. "I am 26 now, and I am tired of fighting for things that the world has decided I should not have." He did not have an answer for that. He wanted one badly, but he did not have it, and he knew better than to offer her something that was not real just because the silence was uncomfortable. He went back to his bourbon, and she went back to her ledger, and neither of them spoke again that afternoon. And Eli Harding felt the specific, aching helplessness of a man who has just understood something important and does not yet know what to do about it. Gerald Fitch arrived in Harlan Creek on a Wednesday, traveling in a hired coach from Santa Fe with a case of wine and a lawyer named Maddox who wore a city suit and carried a leather case, and looked around the territory with the expression of a man who has taken a wrong turn and is hoping no one will notice. Fitch was a thin man in his mid-40s with a gray mustache and the slightly apologetic manner of someone who had spent his life making decisions he preferred not to defend. He was not cruel, Eli assessed. He was simply comfortable with outcomes that were cruel, which was a common variety of human failing and no less damaging for being ordinary. He met with Rosa in the saloon office on Thursday morning, and Eli was in the main room, near enough to hear the door but not the words. He watched the door for 45 minutes. When Rosa came out, her face was arranged in its usual careful order, but her hands were not entirely steady, and she went directly to her table and picked up her pen, and began writing something with a concentration that was clearly designed to prevent her from feeling anything she did not have time to feel. Eli did not approach her. He knew when not to. He went to find Rupert instead, who confirmed what Eli had already suspected. The sale was finalized. Carver Dunn would take possession of the Lucky Star in 30 days. Rosa would be paid for the remainder of the month, and given a letter of reference that Fitch's lawyer had apparently already drafted, because he had presumably known the meeting's outcome before it occurred. 30 days. Eli thought about 30 days and what they meant, and what he was doing with his own life, which was not, by any honest accounting, much. He was a man between things, occupying a corner table in a saloon in a New Mexico Territory town, and drinking bourbon slowly, and watching a woman he was beginning to understand. He cared about a great deal more than was convenient for either of them. He was also, now that he examined it with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who has nothing to lose, a man who had never, in his 28 years, done something that mattered specifically to another person. He had worked hard and been decent and kept his word, and all of those things were fine as qualities went. But they had never been directed at anything that meant something beyond the paycheck at the end of the month. The thought settled in him like a stone dropping into deep water, rippling outward. He went to Fitch. He found the man in the hotel across from the church. Harlan Creek's only hotel, a 3-room establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Paulson, who charged more than the Lucky Star and was considerably less comfortable. Fitch was eating a late breakfast, and he looked up at Eli with the wariness of a man who has recently done something he expects to be challenged about. "I want to talk to you about Rosa Mercer's position," Eli said, sitting down without being invited. Fitch set down his fork. "And who exactly are you?" "Someone who understands accounts," Eli said, which was not quite an answer, but it was the correct response, because Fitch was the kind of man who respected competence more than authority. "I have been watching how she runs your operation for 3 weeks. She is saving you roughly $40 a month in waste and billing errors. Dunn knows what that's worth." Fitch was quiet for a moment, doing the calculations that men like him always did when presented with numbers. "The sale is already contracted," he said. "Then talk to Dunn. Tell him what she's worth to the operation. He's a businessman. He'll listen to the numbers." Fitch looked at him with the slightly bemused expression of a man being pushed in a direction he had not expected. "Why do you care?" he said. It was a fair question, and Eli took a moment before answering it, because the honest answer was complicated and the simple answer was dishonest, and he had not spent enough time in Harlan Creek to have learned how to be strategic about things he actually cared about. Because she has worked for 7 years to build something respectable in a territory that makes that very difficult for a woman in her circumstances. And it is wrong for it to be taken from her, because of a sale she was never told about," Eli said. Fitch looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You're in love with her," Eli said. "That is not the point." "No," Fitch agreed, "but it's true." Eli did not answer that, because the honest answer would have required him to examine something he was not yet ready to examine in the full light of day, and because Fitch's expression had shifted from wariness to something that looked almost like guilt, which was more useful. Fitch agreed to write to Carve Dunn about Rosa's role in the operation. He could not promise anything, he said. Dunn's preferences were firm, but he would present the financial case, and if Dunn could be persuaded by arithmetic, he would be. Eli walked back to the Lucky Star and told nobody what he had done. The letter to Dunn went out on the Thursday Evening Post. The reply, when it came a week and a half later, was politely negative. Dunn had his own methods of bookkeeping, it said, and his own arrangements for staff. He wished Miss Mercer well in her future endeavors. Eli read the letter over Rupert's shoulder and felt the specific anger of a man who has tried the correct thing and had it fail through no deficiency in the trying. He did not tell Rosa about any of it, not the conversation with Fitch, not the letter, not its outcome. He was not certain why. Part of it was that she had not asked him to do it and would not have, and he did not want her to feel the weight of his investment in her situation. Part of it was something more complicated that he had not fully untangled, a reluctance to let her know how much her circumstance had begun to matter to him, because mattering was a kind of exposure, and exposure was a kind of risk, Eli Harding had spent 2 years following a romantic catastrophe learning to manage his risks. He kept coming to the saloon. He kept sitting at his corner table. He kept talking to Rosa about the accounts, about the territory, about the books she had in her room. She was a reader, which surprised him and then did not surprise him at all, and about the careful, incremental things that make up the daily texture of two people beginning to know each other. She told him about Las Cruces, about the hotel where she had worked before Harlan Creek, about the way she had taught herself bookkeeping from a manual she had found in the hotel's office and studied in the evenings after her shift. She told him about her father without bitterness, which impressed him because bitterness would have been entirely warranted, about the particular loneliness of growing up the child of a man who was present physically and absent in every other measurable way, and about how she had learned to rely on herself with such thoroughness that the prospect of relying on anyone else produced in her a near physical discomfort. "Is that why you stay?" he asked one evening. Even with the sale coming, she was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing the territorial thing it did in autumn, pushing against the walls of the building with a constant low pressure that sounded like breathing. "I stay because I have not yet determined where to go," she said, "and because being undecided is not the same as being defeated." "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him across the table with those dark, reading eyes, and she said carefully, "You are still here." "I am." "You have been here for 5 weeks. You are not a man who has business in Harlan Creek. You have no ranch, no employment that I can identify, and you pay your room by the week." "That is accurate," he said. "Why?" She asked, and it was the most direct question she had ever put to him, and he understood it was not really about the town. He took a slow breath. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "I think you know why," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. Rosa Mercer looked at him steadily, and then she looked away, and there was something in the turning away that was not rejection, but was something closer to fear. The specific fear of someone who has wanted something for a while and is now confronted with the possibility of having it, and cannot yet determine whether the having would be better or worse than the wanting. "I need you to understand something," she said to the middle distance. "I have managed my life by being very careful about what I allow to matter, because things that matter are things that can be lost." "I know," he said. "I am not saying that to be unkind. I know that too." She was quiet again. "Tell me something honest," she said finally. "Ask me something and I will tell you honestly." She turned and looked at him. "Do you plan to stay in Harlan Creek?" The question was layered and they both knew it. He said, "I have nowhere more important to be." It was the truest thing he had said in 2 years, and she received it with a stillness that told him it had landed. They did not speak of it again that evening. But something had shifted in the way of tectonic plates that have been under pressure for months. Not dramatically, not visibly from the surface, but in a deep and structural way, so that the landscape above, while still apparently the same, would never again be quite what it was before. It was 3 days later that Hollis Pratt rode into Harlan Creek with 4 other cattle drivers, the last of a season's work in their pockets, looking for somewhere to spend it. Pratt was a man Eli classified within the first 5 minutes of seeing him as the kind of trouble that was not looking for a reason, only an opportunity. He was loud in the way that is actually a form of aggression, testing the room's tolerance with escalating volume and finding it, in the Lucky Star's genial end of weak atmosphere, more forgiving than it should have been. Eli watched from his corner table. He had positioned himself in that corner out of habit. It gave him sight lines to the door and the bar and the stairs, and it put his back against solid wood, which was the kind of thing you learned to value if you had spent any time in lawless places. He had a single glass of bourbon. He was not drunk. He never drank enough to be drunk, which was a thing Rosa had noticed and mentioned with a precision that was almost admiring. 2 weeks prior, Pratt had been in the saloon for 3 hours when he turned his attention to Rosa. She was doing what she always did in the evening, moving between the bar and the tables with the efficient awareness of someone managing an environment. She spoke briefly to Chester at the piano. She checked the bottles behind the bar. She said something quiet to one of the women by the stairs, who nodded and straightened her posture. She was every inch the professional she had made herself, and she had, by 2 years of consistent practice, trained the regular customers of the Lucky Star to treat her as such. Pratt was not a regular customer. He caught her arm as she passed, not her wrist, not yet, but the deliberate claiming pressure of a large hand on a woman's elbow. "Hey," he said in the voice of a man who considers the word sufficient. "Hey, I am talking to you." Rosa stopped. She turned to look at his hand on her arm, and then at his face, with an expression that Eli recognized as controlled danger. The look of someone who has handled this precise situation before and knows exactly how much of her real response she can afford to show. "Let go of my arm," she said quietly. "I just want to talk to you," Pratt said. "I have been watching you all night. You are something." "I work here," Rosa said. "I am not available for conversation." "That is a fine attitude." His grip tightened. His friends at the bar laughed encouragingly in the way that men laugh when one of their number is doing something they know is wrong but find exciting. "I paid for my drinks. I am a customer." "Your drinks paid for your drinks," Rosa said. "That is what they were for." She tried to extract her arm and could not, because Pratt was holding on with the determination of a man who had decided this was a test of something and was committed to not failing it. Eli set down his glass. He was aware of the room the way he always was, and he was aware that the room was aware of him now. That the moment he put down the glass, a ripple went through the men at the bar and the men at the tables, a subtle tensing of the air. Rosa said, and her voice was still steady, but there was something underneath it now, something controlled but breakable. "I am not worth fighting over. Just let me go." And then, because she was Rosa Mercer, and she had spent 7 years maintaining the armor, and it was late in the month, and the letter from Dunn had arrived, and the world was doing what the world always did, the armor cracked, just slightly, just enough, and she said the words that stopped everyone's heart. "I am not worth fighting for." She said it with such bone-deep conviction that it landed like a declaration of fact, not self-pity. The measured statement of a woman who has accepted a verdict that has been handed down to her so many times by so many sources that it has become, in her internal accounting, simply the truth. Every man in the saloon was still, and then Eli Harding stood up. He crossed the room without hurrying. Pratt watched him come with the calculating expression of a man determining whether the newcomer is going to be a problem and reaching the conclusion, too late, that he is. "Let her go," Eli said. "I heard you the first time," Pratt said. "I am asking, who are you to tell me anything?" "I am the man standing in front of you," Eli said. "And I am telling you that you are going to let go of her arm in the next 3 seconds, and then you are going to sit back down at the bar, and you are going to finish your drink and leave, and nothing else is going to happen. And if I do not feel like it, then something else is going to happen," Eli said simply. He was not performing threat. He was stating a calculation. He was entirely calm, and that calmness, that absence of heat or aggression, was somehow more convincing than shouting would have been. Pratt felt it. Everyone in the room felt it. Pratt was a man who had won fights on bluster, and he could read, in Eli Harding's gray-green eyes, that bluster was not going to work here in any way that ended well for him. He let go of Rosa's arm. "Just having a conversation," he said loudly to the room. "Good," Eli said. "Then it is finished." He held Pratt's gaze until Pratt looked away, which took perhaps 4 seconds, and then Eli turned and looked at Rosa. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, gratitude and something beneath gratitude that was more complicated and more raw. And underneath that, still, the residue of what she had said about herself, the conviction that had shaped the words. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He turned and walked back to his corner table, and he sat back down and he picked up his glass, and he did not look at her again for the rest of the evening because he understood that she needed to not be looked at right now. The saloon gradually unwound from its held breath. Chester started playing again. The bar conversations resumed. Pratt and his companions finished their drinks in a modified silence and left without further incident. Rosa returned to her duties with the same composure she always had, except that once, crossing the room near his table, she slowed almost imperceptibly and let out a long breath through her nose, as though she had been holding it, and then moved on. When the saloon emptied toward midnight and Rupert was putting out the lamps, Eli was still sitting there with an empty glass and a head full of things he was sorting through. Rosa came to his table. She sat down across from him without ceremony, in the chair that had gradually, over weeks of afternoons and evenings, become in some practical sense her chair when it was his table. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me." "I want to." She paused. "I want to say something else, and I need you to let me say it without arguing." "All right." She looked up. What I said in the room, I should not have said it like that. I should not have said it at all." Her voice was low and very precise, the voice of a woman being honest with herself in real time, which was clearly an effort. "It was true, in the way that things become true when you have been told them long enough. But I know, sitting here right now, that it was not." She stopped. "It was not a thing I should have believed." Eli looked at her steadily. "Who told you that you were not worth it?" She was quiet for a moment. "The territory," she said finally. "The way the territory works for people like me, my father's name, the circumstances I was born into. The men who looked at my circumstances and decided what they said about me." She paused. "I have done my best to contradict them, and I have done well by most measures, but tonight, for a moment, I could hear all of them at once." "I know that sound," Eli said. She looked at him sharply. It was not something he had said before. "I spent 2 years," he said, "hearing the version of myself that someone else's choices had created, the man who was not enough, who was not worth the choosing." He turned his glass on the table, a slow rotation. "It is a very loud sound, and it drowns out other things." She was watching him with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered. "What drowns it out?" she asked. He looked up. "Finding something worth standing up for," he said. The moment stretched between them in the lamplight. Rosa Mercer looked at Eli Harding, and he looked at her, and all the weeks of careful, measured proximity collapsed into this single point, this held breath, this recognition. "Eli," she said. "I know," he said. "I am frightened," she said, with a directness that cost her something. He could see it costing her, could see the effort of allowing that vulnerability to be spoken aloud. "So am I," he said. And that was true as well. She reached across the table and put one hand over his where it rested around his glass. Not grasping, not dramatic, just contact. The warm, specific weight of another person's hand. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it, and they sat like that in the nearly dark saloon with the wind pressing against the walls outside, and neither of them needed to say anything else. It was Rupert, extinguishing the last lamp at the bar and pretending with obvious and touching ineptitude not to notice them, who finally broke the spell. He cleared his throat with theatrical loudness, said "good night then" to the room in general, and retreated to the back, and Rosa laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, low and warm, and Eli felt it like sunlight through glass. "Good night, Rupert," she called, and the sound of her laughing was the best thing Eli had heard in years. Over the following weeks, everything that had been building between them found its expression in a new and different key. They still talked at the corner table in the afternoons, but now there was no careful distance in it. They leaned toward each other when they spoke, and sometimes her shoulder touched his, and sometimes he caught her eye across the room in the evening, and she did not look away but held his gaze for a moment before returning to her work, and the holding was a kind of conversation all its own. He began helping her in earnest with the transition that Fitch's sale required. The handover to Carver done was a month away, and there was a significant amount of administrative work, cataloging inventory, reconciling accounts, writing up the operational documentation that Dunn's organization would need. Rosa worked on it with her usual methodical precision, but she accepted Eli's help now without the careful courtesy she had maintained before, which meant without emotional distance, which was entirely different. "You are very good at this," she said one afternoon, watching him work through a column of figures. "Numbers stay where you put them," he said. "That is what I like about them." "Unlike people," she said. He glanced at her. "Unlike most things." She was looking at him with a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one, and he set down his pen and looked at her properly, and she said, "What are you thinking about?" "You," he said, without hesitation. The precursor became an actual smile, quick and real and not managed at all, and she looked down at the table with a brightness about her face that was new. "You are very direct when you choose to be," she said. "I spent a long time being careful about it," he said. "It did not particularly help." She looked back up. "What changed?" "You," he said again with the same simplicity. Rosa Mercer looked at Eli Harding in the afternoon light coming through the Lucky Star's back window, and the careful structure she had built around herself. The armor of self-sufficiency, the walls of managed expectations, showed, definitively, its first real crack. "I need to think about what happens next," she said. "When Dunn takes over, I have been thinking practically about employment, about where else I might find work." "Have you thought about other possibilities?" he said. She was quiet. "I am trying not to think about things that are uncertain," she said carefully. "What if I told you something certain?" She met his eyes. He took a breath. He had not planned this moment, or rather, he had been thinking about it for weeks and had not decided when it would arrive. And then it had arrived anyway, as moments that have been building always do. "I have been sitting in this town for 6 weeks doing nothing except being glad I am here," he said. "That is a thing I have never been able to say before. About anywhere." He paused. "I would like to stay. I would like to find a reason to stay that is larger than a room by the week." Rosa was very still. "There is land," he said, "north of here by about 8 miles along the creek. I looked at it last week. The water rights are available. It is not much, but it is a start, and I have enough money to file on it, and I know cattle, and with time—" He stopped, because he was doing the thing he knew he did, which was retreating to the practical when the personal was where he actually lived. "Eli," she said, "I am asking if you would consider letting me be something to you that is more than a man at a corner table," he said. "That is what I am asking." She was quiet for a long moment, and he held himself steady through the quiet, because she deserved the time to think, and he would not rush her with his own urgency. "I have spent a very long time," she said slowly, "believing that the reasonable course was to not want things I was unlikely to have, Because wanting unlikely things is how people break themselves on disappointment. She stopped. And then you came and sat at my table and helped me with my columns and looked at me like I was worth looking at. Like the whole of me was worth looking at. And I have spent 6 weeks trying to decide if that was real, or if it was a thing I was allowing myself to believe because I was tired of being careful. It is real, he said. I know, she said. That is what makes it terrifying. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way she had taken his in the lamplight weeks before, and she looked at their joined hands and then at him, and he said, I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to be careful with me instead of from me. Rosa Mercer closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, there was something in them that had not been there before, not hope exactly, but the decision to allow hope, which is a braver thing. All right, she said. It was the simplest word and it changed everything. Carver Dunn arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in November, 11 days before the transfer date, to inspect his new acquisition. He was a broad man in his early 50s with an organized manner, and the particular confidence of someone who had turned money into more money for long enough that he had come to believe the process spoke well of his character. He walked through the Lucky Star with Fitch and his lawyer Maddox, and made assessments in the voice of a man who was used to having them received uncritically. He looked at the accounts, which Rosa had prepared with her usual meticulous care, and he was visibly impressed against his will, because the numbers were perfectly kept, and the operational documentation was comprehensive in a way that would have taken his own staff months to produce. Whoever did this, he said, indicating the ledgers to Maddox, did excellent work. That would be Miss Mercer, Fitch said. Dunn glanced at Rosa, who was standing at a professional distance with her hands folded, watching him with the neutral expression she deployed when she was thinking something she did not intend to share. She did all of this herself, Dunn said. Every column, Fitch said. Dunn was quiet for a moment in the way of a man revising an opinion. He turned to Rosa directly. I had planned, he said, and he had the grace to sound slightly uncomfortable about it, to restructure the management here. I am aware, Rosa said. I was told you were, he paused, reaching for the word his earlier assumptions had used. An irregular arrangement. I am the person who has run this establishment profitably for 2 years, Rosa said, calmly and without heat. Those are 2 descriptions of the same fact. Dunn looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the ledgers. Eli, watching from the bar, saw the moment the arithmetic won. I would like to discuss a continued arrangement, Dunn said. Rosa said, I would be willing to discuss it. And she said it with the measured dignity of a woman who has been offered something she deserved, and is deciding whether the terms are adequate, which was exactly the right response. And Eli felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with bourbon. The arrangement they reached was not everything Rosa deserved. Dunn was too much of a businessman to offer more than he had to, but it was real employment with real wages and a defined scope of responsibility, and it was hers for as long as she wanted it, with enough stability that she could plan around it. When Dunn and Fitch and Maddox had gone to their hotel to conclude the paperwork, Rosa found Eli at his corner table and sat down and looked at him with an expression that was not quite the one she usually wore. Did you go to Fitch? She said. He met her eyes. 6 weeks ago. It did not work at the time. She was quiet for a moment. You did not tell me. You did not want to be saved, he said. You wanted to be heard. Those are different things. She considered this. Then she said with a precision that meant she was being very honest, you are right about that. And I think you knew I did not want to be saved, which is why you went to Fitch instead of coming to me first. Yes. And the financial argument with Dunn today, did you have anything to do with that? I showed Rupert the third quarter's operational comparison this morning, Eli said. Rupert mentioned it to Fitch before the walkthrough. What Fitch said to Dunn about the ledgers was Fitch's own conclusion. Rosa looked at him steadily. You prepared the ground, she said. I stacked the firewood, he said. You lit it yourself. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Eli? Yes. You stood up for me in front of a room full of men when I told you not to bother. You did not tell me not to bother, he said. You told me you were not worth it. That is different. I disagreed. You did, she said, and there was something in her voice that was very soft and very warm and entirely real. You disagreed very clearly. I intend to keep disagreeing, he said, as long as you will let me. The smile that came then was not the quick, managed thing she sometimes allowed herself. It was full and unheld and entirely Rosa, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in the better part of 2 years, and he thought, with the clear simplicity of a man who has finally stopped arguing with his own heart, yes. This. Here. He filed on the land north of Harlan Creek on a Friday morning at the land office in the county seat, which was a long day's ride east. He took Rupert with him because Rupert wanted to see the county seat and had been to the land office before and knew the paperwork. They rode back in the evening with the filing recorded and a provisional grant issued, and the land, 40 acres along the creek, with a stand of cottonwoods in the lower third and good grazing grass on the upper, was in Eli Harding's name. He told Rosa that evening. She had known he was going to do it, because they had talked about it, but knowing it and hearing it said were different things, and she put her hands on the back of a chair and looked at him with an expression that had joy in it, and something else beneath the joy that was still faintly precarious. The way a new thing is precarious before it has been tested by time. 40 acres, she said. It is a start, he said. What will you do with it? Build, he said. Cattle, eventually. It will take time. I have a small amount of savings and I know how to work. He paused. I would like, when the time comes, to have a reason to build something larger than one man needs. She looked at him across the space between them. I am not saying now, he said. I am saying that I am building towards something, and I want you to know what I am building toward, so that you can decide whether that is a direction you want to know about. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took his face in both her hands and kissed him, and it was the first time they had kissed. And it was the kind of first kiss that feels both sudden and entirely inevitable, the way a storm does when you have been watching the clouds build all afternoon. He put his arms around her and held her with the specific, careful certainty of a man who has been given something precious and knows it. And she leaned into him with a completeness that she would not have been capable of 6 weeks before. And the saloon around them was empty except for Chester at the piano playing something quiet and probably deliberate. I know what direction I want, she said, against his shoulder. They were not precipitous about the rest of it. They were both people who had been hurt by rushing and who had discovered in each other the unusual comfort of someone who was willing to take the time that things actually needed. They spent the winter in Harlan Creek, Rosa managing the Lucky Star under Dunn's ownership, which she did with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and Eli building on his land north of town. He bought timber and hauled it himself, with help from a taciturn but good-natured man named Samuel Trout, who had done carpentry for half the buildings in Harlan Creek and who charged fairly and worked fast. By February, they had the shell of a house, small, honest, 2 rooms with a proper kitchen hearth and a wood plank floor that Eli leveled himself. By March, he had a stable, and by April he had acquired 6 cattle from a rancher who was selling off part of his herd, and the 40 acres had the beginning of a working shape. Rosa came out to the land on Sundays. They would ride out together after noon, and she would walk the land with him in the way she walked through the saloon, attentively, seeing things, asking questions that revealed how much she had already been thinking about what she observed. She noted where the water ran after rain. She noticed which grass was thicker and where. She asked about fencing and about what the cattle needed and listened to his answers with the same focused attention she gave to account columns. On a Sunday in late April, standing at the edge of the cottonwood stand with the creek running low and silver below them, she said, "It is good land, Eli." "I know," he said. She was quiet, looking at the water. The afternoon was warm in the particular way of New Mexico spring, the kind of warm that feels like a promise. "I have been thinking," she said. He waited. "Dunn has told me the arrangement can continue indefinitely as long as I am satisfied with it." She paused. "I am satisfied with it. It is what I built, and I am good at it, and it pays well enough. But I have also been thinking about what it would mean to be part of something that I have a different kind of stake in." She stopped again. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said. She turned to face him, and there was the Rosa who was not afraid. Not the composed, careful armor, but the actual woman underneath it, who wanted things and knew it and was choosing to say so. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would like to be the woman who keeps the accounts for the Harding ranch, if that position is available." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That position requires a certain commitment." "I am aware," she said, "and you are making it." He said it quietly, because the moment was quiet and rushing it would have been wrong. "I am making it," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and she held still for it in a way that was not stillness but acceptance, which was a thing she gave carefully and meant completely. "Then there is a preacher in Harlan Creek," he said, "who has a very drafty church that I have walked past many times and never entered. I think it is overdue." She laughed, that low, real, warm laugh, and said, "I suspect Reverend Hollies would agree." They were married in June of 1883, on a Saturday morning, in the drafty church that proved, on the occasion, to be somewhat less drafty than expected, possibly because every person in Harlan Creek, and several from the surrounding area, had filled it to the walls and provided their own warmth. Rupert was there, emotional in the quietly leaking way of men who deny having feelings. Chester Hale played something on the church's upright organ that bore only a passing resemblance to a hymn, but was deeply felt. Mrs. Paulson from the hotel brought a cake that was technically competent. Samuel Trout wore the only suit he owned and sat in the front row, and nodded throughout the ceremony, with the satisfied expression of a man who has built something good and is seeing its purpose confirmed. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, cream cotton with careful embroidery at the cuffs and neckline, modest and precise and entirely hers. The most beautiful dress Eli had ever seen, partly because she had made it and partly because she was in it. She walked down the aisle of the drafty church with her chin level and her eyes on him with an expression that was not performed happiness but actual joy. Unguarded, uncalculated, given freely by someone who had spent a very long time not giving things freely, and had discovered that the giving was not the loss she had feared, but something altogether different. He stood at the front and watched her come toward him and felt the specific, complete certainty of a man who has found his true place in the world. Not a location but a person, not a destination but a direction, and the direction was toward her. And it had been toward her. He understood now. From the moment he had stood up in the Lucky Star Saloon, and every man in the room had watched him do it. When Reverend Hollies asked if anyone had reason to object, there was a silence in which the wind outside the church was audible. And then Rupert made a sound that was not quite an objection and turned it successfully into a cough. And everyone in the building laughed. And Rosa laughed. And Eli laughed. and it was the best sound he had ever heard, the laughter of a room full of people who were happy for two people who had fought to deserve each other. "I do," Rosa said when the time came with a directness that was entirely her. "I do," Eli said, with a simplicity that was entirely him. Reverend Hollis pronounced them married with the undisguised satisfaction of a man who did not often get to preside over something uncomplicated. And Eli kissed his wife in the drafty church in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1883, and the room applauded with the genuine warmth of people who have watched something earned. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon, just the two of them, and she sat beside him on the bench of the wagon he had bought in the spring, her shoulder against his, and the cottonwoods along the creek were green with June growth, and the land was theirs, and the afternoon light on the red rock was the color of copper and amber, and neither of them spoke for much of the ride because there was nothing that needed to be said. The first year on the ranch was not easy, because first years never are. The work was relentless and physical, and there were problems. A fence section that kept going down, a dry month in August that worried the cattle, a dispute with a neighboring landowner named Gordon Pierce about where the eastern boundary actually ran, which required a surveyor from the county seat, and 3 uncomfortable conversations before it was resolved properly. Rosa ran the accounts for the ranch with the same methodology she brought to everything, and her records were as clean and precise as the Lucky Stars had ever been. She also managed to keep 1 day a week at the Lucky Star under Dunn's arrangement, which provided supplemental income during the first year when the ranch was not yet fully self-sustaining, and which she did not give up until she was ready to give it up, which was her decision made in her own time and on her own terms. She learned the cattle with the same focused attention she had given everything she had ever decided to understand. She learned when the animals were sick and when they were healthy, and she learned what the land told you if you paid attention. And she became, over the course of that first year, a rancher's wife in the most complete sense. Not a person on the periphery of the ranch's life, but someone woven into its fabric, essential and present and capable. Eli watched her learning these things with an admiration that never diminished, because she never stopped surprising him. She was sharp and direct and funny in a dry, quiet way that emerged more and more as she trusted him with it. And she had opinions about everything and was never wrong twice about the same thing. And she still sometimes looked at the land with an expression that was not quite wonder, but was its practical cousin, the satisfaction of a person who cannot quite believe what they have built. He loved her with the steady, whole-hearted certainty of a man who had taken a long time to find the right thing, and had no intention of treating it carelessly now that he had it. He told her so regularly, not with grand speeches but with the ordinary dailiness of it, in the morning when they worked side by side, in the evenings on the porch when the light went red on the mesa, in the small and particular moments that accumulate into a life. She told him in return, with the same directness she applied to everything, and every time she said it, he felt it freshly, the way you feel the warmth every time you step out of shadow into sun, even though you know the sun is always there. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with the same directness she used for everything, and his response was to be still for a full 3 seconds, and then reach across the table and take both her hands in his, and look at her with an expression that she would describe later, to Rupert, as the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very all right," she said, with a smile that was entirely real. "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. "A little," she said, "but I am frightened of most things that matter and I do them anyway." I have learned that from someone. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the kitchen was warm with the morning fire, and outside the cottonwoods were beginning to green again, and the ranch was alive and working, and everything they had built was real. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a cold, clear night with stars so thick across the New Mexico sky that the territory looked as though someone had flung a lantern's worth of sparks across black velvet. He was a healthy, loud, emphatic boy who arrived with opinions already firmly in place, which Rosa said was inevitable given his parentage. They named him James William Harding, James because it was a plain and honest name, and William, which Eli had suggested carefully and Rosa had accepted after a quiet moment, because it had been her father's name, and naming the future after the past was a way of saying that the past did not get to define where things went from here. Rupert came out to the ranch the week after and held the baby with an expression of absolute terror masking absolute love, and said, gruffly, that James was a fine-looking boy, and then handed him immediately back to Rosa, and then stood outside for a moment in the cold air composing himself. Chester Hale sent a card. Samuel Trout built a cradle without being asked and delivered it without ceremony, setting it on the porch and tipping his hat to Rosa before riding off before she could thank him properly, which she found she could not be angry about because it was so entirely Samuel Trout. The years that followed built on each other in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because a ranch in the New Mexico territory in the 1880s was not a difficulty-free life, and there were hard winters and dry summers, and the ongoing work of an enterprise that never fully rested. Gordon Pierce continued to be occasionally difficult. There was a bad season in 1886 that required them to sell more cattle than they would have liked and live more carefully than was comfortable for 6 months. Eli took a fall from a horse in the spring of 1887 that left him unable to work at full capacity for 3 weeks, during which Rosa ran every aspect of the ranch without complaint, and without anyone being able to say that anything fell short. But the difficulty was the kind that builds rather than the kind that breaks, and they met it together with the specific competence of 2 people who trust each other completely and have enough mutual respect to say when something is hard, without feeling that saying so is a weakness. James grew into a serious, bright boy who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's facility with numbers and both of their stubbornness in equal measure, which made him, at 4 years old, exhausting and wonderful in roughly equal proportions. In the summer of 1888, Rosa told him she was expecting again. This time he was not still for 3 seconds. This time he stood up from his chair and pulled her to him and held her close in the kitchen, and she laughed against his shoulder, and he felt the same thing he always felt when she laughed, the specific, uncomplicated joy of a man who has been given more than he deserved and knows it, and intends to be worthy of it every day. Their second child was a girl, born in the late winter of 1889, and she was as loud and emphatic as her brother had been, which reassured everyone who knew the family. They named her Clara Mee Harding, and she had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's precision. And James, who had been prepared with careful attention for the arrival of a sibling, and had accepted the preparation with equanimity, looked at her in Rosa's arms with the expression of someone who has just discovered a new and compelling subject. "She is very small," James observed. "She will get bigger," Rosa said. "Will she be useful?" James asked. Eli bit the inside of his cheek. Rosa said, "Eventually, yes." James nodded seriously and went back to whatever he had been doing, satisfied. By the time Clara was a year old, the ranch had 30 cattle, a proper vegetable garden that Rosa had established in the sheltered lower ground near the cottonwoods, an addition to the house that had been built the summer before to accommodate the growing family, and a reputation in Harlan Creek as one of the better-run small operations in the county. Eli was known as a fair dealer and a good neighbor, except during the ongoing Gordon Pierce situation, which had become more historical than actual and was maintained largely by habit on both sides. One evening in the summer of 1890, they sat on the porch after the children were in bed, the way they often did, watching the last of the light go off the mesa and the first stars come out above the red rock. Rosa had a cup of tea and Eli had nothing, and the night was warm and the crickets were going and the cattle were quiet in the lower pasture and everything was entirely still. "You remember," Rosa said without preamble, "what you said to me in the saloon, the first night." "I told Pratt to let go of you," he said. "Before that," she said, he thought. "I told him that something else was going to happen. Before that." He was quiet and then he said softly, "I told him to let you go. You stood up," she said, "in front of every man in that room. When I had just told you not to bother." She paused. "When I had just said I was not worth it." "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars come out one at a time over the mesa, the way they did in the New Mexico territory, with a gradual and unhurried beauty. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "What it felt like to watch someone stand up, for me, when I had spent so long believing that there was no reason anyone would." "There was every reason," he said. She turned to look at him. In the dark, her face was a collection of warmth and shadow, and her eyes were the dark, reading eyes he had known for 7 years and had never stopped wanting to meet. "I know that now," she said. "I have known it for a long time." She paused. "I just want to make sure you know that I know it. That I understand what you did and what it meant. Not just that night, but all of it. All the things you did quietly and without making a performance of it." "Rosa," he said. "I am not done," she said, with the gentle firmness she used when she was saying something important. He was quiet. "I spent 7 years believing the world's verdict on me," she said. "And then you came and sat at my table and disagreed with it, quietly and persistently, and you did not need me to thank you for it, and you did not do it to make me owe you something, and you built a life next to mine that made room for me to be exactly what I am." She stopped. Her voice was low and steady, and there was something in it that was not sad but was the kind of deep that only comes from meaning something completely. "I am telling you that I know how rare that is. I am telling you that I do not take it for granted for a single day." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the dark, and she threaded her fingers through his and held on, and they sat together on the porch of the house he had built, and she had made into something more than a house, with their children asleep inside and the land they had worked spread out before them in the warm summer dark, and the stars doing what they always did over the New Mexico territory, burning bright and steady and innumerable against the black. "I stood up because you were worth everything," he said. "You have always been worth everything." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said, and the way she said it told him that she truly did, not as a courtesy, not as a performance of confidence, but as an actual, settled, inhabited truth. The verdict she had carried for 7 years had been replaced, not by him, but by herself, with his company as evidence. That was the thing about Rosa Mercer. Rosa Harding now. 7 years a wife and 7 years a rancher, and 7 years the woman who kept the books and raised the children and walked the land with the attention it deserved. And 7 years the woman who laughed at Rupert's expressions and let Chester Hale's music follow her down the street when she passed the Lucky Star and argued with Gordon Pierce directly, and without apology, and held Eli's hand on the porch in the summer dark. She had not been saved. She had been witnessed. She had been seen clearly and valued accurately and offered the space to build what she had always had inside her but had been told, by a world that was often wrong about women in her position, that she was not allowed to have. Nobody had given her that. Eli had only pointed at it. She had walked toward it herself, with her chin level and her eyes clear, and the particular courage of someone who has decided, after careful consideration, to believe in themselves. And Eli Harding, who had ridden into Harlan Creek on a cold October morning in 1882, with $40 and nothing in particular to go toward, had found the thing that every man who had been in that saloon the night he stood up had been able to see, that this was the woman worth standing for. Not because she was helpless, not because she needed rescuing, but because she was extraordinary, and the world had spent too long telling her otherwise, and he had never, not for a single moment since the first evening, he sat at her corner table and made her laugh about Rupert extinguishing the lamps, believed anything else. The years continued their good building. James started school in 1890 in Harlan Creek's newly established schoolhouse, where he quickly became known as the student most likely to correct the teacher's arithmetic, and do so politely enough that the teacher could not reasonably object. Clara grew into a child who was interested in everything with an insatiable specificity that exhausted and delighted everyone around her equally. The ranch grew steadily. By 1891, they had enough cattle that Eli hired on a permanent hand, a young man named Marcus Webb, 18 years old, who had come up from the South looking for work, and who proved to be the kind of worker who did not need to be told the same thing twice, and who ate dinner at their table most evenings without ceremony. Rosa liked him immediately because he was honest about what he did not know and learned fast, and Eli liked him because he was good with the cattle and respectful to Rosa, and kind to the children in the unaffected way of someone who simply was what he was. The Gordon Pierce situation was finally resolved in 1892, definitively and with handshakes, when a new survey confirmed Eli's position on the boundary, and Pierce, to his credit, accepted the result without ongoing grievance, and even offered a brief and awkward apology over the fence line that Eli accepted with the equal brevity that the moment called for. In 1893, Rupert retired from the Lucky Star. Dunn had finally sold it to a new owner, a younger man from Colorado who had ideas about the place that Rupert found exhausting. And Eli hired him to help with the ranch's business administration, which had grown to the point that Rosa's one day a week devoted to the books was no longer quite sufficient. Rupert was not a natural rancher, but he was a natural record keeper in the broad sense, and having him at the ranch meant that Rosa could spend more time on the other things that had grown to fill her days: the garden, the children, the careful and patient work of building a life that had enough room in it for everything. Chester Hale kept playing piano. He played at James's birthday celebration, when the boy turned 10, and at Clara's birthday celebrations, and at the small parties that Rosa and Eli gave on the occasional summer evening when the light was good, and the neighbors came, and everyone sat on the expanded porch that Samuel Trout had built in 1891. He played at the evening when Eli and Rosa stood on that porch and told their guests that a third child was expected in the autumn of 1894. Their third child was a boy, born in October, whom they named Thomas Edward Harding. Thomas because Rosa's favorite book, Worn from Reading, was Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and she had always liked the directness of the name, and Edward because it had been Eli's grandfather's name, and the old man had been the first person in Eli's experience to treat women with consistent and unself-conscious respect, which seemed like the right thing to honor. Thomas was a quieter child than his siblings, more given to observation than declaration, with the quality of someone who was taking everything in carefully and would produce conclusions about it later. He had Rosa's dark eyes and Eli's jaw, and the particular stillness of a person who would always know more than they said, which Rosa recognized in him early and found both familiar and deeply reassuring. By the mid-1890s, the Harding Ranch was established and working and good, and the family that lived on it was the kind of family that is built from the inside out, not from circumstances or convention, but from the daily practice of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the costs and had found the investment entirely worth it. Eli was 40 years old in 1894 and felt less worn than he had at 28. He attributed this to the specific alchemy of a life that had a center and a direction, and a reason to be present in each of its days. He still sat at corner tables in rooms when the opportunity arose. It was a habit he would never fully shed, but he no longer sat in corners because there was nowhere he needed to be. He sat in them because the vantage was good, and he had always liked to know where everyone was, and because from the corner he could see Rosa across whatever room they were in, and seeing Rosa across a room remained, after 12 years, one of the most reliably good things he knew. She still kept the accounts. The Harding Ranch's books were, as they had always been, flawless. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1895, she found him at the fence line of the lower pasture, doing a repair that Marcus had started and left for him to finish. The sky was the particular deep blue of New Mexico in October, and the cottonwoods were going yellow along the creek, and the air had the edge in it that meant real cold was coming. She brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him at the fence and looked at the land with the expression he knew well, not wonder and not satisfaction, but the steady, inhabited ownership of a person looking at something that is genuinely and completely theirs. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "James is going to need more than Harlan Creek School can give him," she said. "There is a school in Albuquerque. I have been corresponding with the administrator. The mathematics program is serious." She paused. "I think we should consider sending him when he is ready." Eli looked at her. "You have already decided," he said. "I have decided it is the right thing," she said. "I am telling you so that we can decide together that it is the right thing." He thought about James, serious, precise, dark-eyed James who corrected arithmetic politely and had read every book in the house twice and was already, at 11, too large for the intellectual space available to him. "Yes," Eli said. "When he is ready." She nodded, satisfied. She drank her coffee and looked at the land. "I wrote to Fitch last month," she said. Eli looked at her. "Gerald Fitch, he is in Santa Fe. I read in a letter from an acquaintance that he had been unwell." She paused. "I wrote to say I bore him no ill will, that things had turned out." She was quiet. He wrote back. He said he was glad. Eli was quiet for a moment, thinking about the man who had tried to remove her and had been wrong about it and had also, in his limited way, been persuaded to try something better. "That was a generous thing," he said. "It cost me nothing," she said, "and I have too much to be carrying old grudges as weight." She turned to look at him. "That is also something I learned from someone." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the way she had leaned into him on the bench of the wagon on their wedding day, and in 1,000 moments since, with the complete, unguarded ease of someone who has found where they belong and has no intention of leaving. The cottonwoods were gold above the silver creek, and the cattle were settled in the lower pasture, and from the house they could hear, faintly, Clara's voice explaining something to Thomas with the emphatic certainty of a 6-year-old who believes she understands everything and is mostly right. "Are you happy?" Rosa said. It was the question she asked sometimes, not from doubt but from the habit of checking, of being present, of not assuming the answer when she could know it. "I am," he said. "Are you?" She was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of her silences that meant she was being honest rather than immediate. Then she said, "I am happy in a way that I did not believe was available to me, which makes it the most complete kind." She paused. "I walked into that saloon 12 years ago believing that I was managing the best circumstances I could expect. And I was wrong. And I am very glad I was wrong." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she turned her face up, and he kissed her in the October light with the yellow cottonwoods behind them, and the land they had built spread out around them. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely perfect, which is the highest thing a life can be. Years later, when their children were grown and the ranch had passed through a decade of good seasons and difficult seasons and come out larger and more settled on the other side, and when Harlan Creek had grown into something that was almost large enough to be called a real town, with a new schoolhouse and a telegraph line and a rail stop an hour to the east, there was a story that the older residents of the county told. They told it about the night in the Lucky Star, in the autumn of 1882, when a woman with dark eyes and a hard-earned life had stood in the middle of the saloon floor and said she was not worth fighting for, and a quiet man from a corner table had disagreed by standing up. It was not told as a story about a man saving a woman. That was not what had happened, and the people who told it knew the difference. It was told as a story about a moment when someone said the wrong thing about themselves, and someone else heard it and refused to let it stand. It was told by Rupert, who told it with wet eyes he denied having. It was told by Chester Hale, who told it with the musician's gift for emotional precision. It was told, eventually, by James and Clara and Thomas Harding, who had grown up knowing the story the way you know the story of how a house was built, as the explanation for the foundation you are standing on. And it was told, once, by Rosa herself, to a young woman in Harlan Creek who was in the circumstances that Rosa recognized from her own history. A woman who had arrived in the territory with a difficult inheritance and a determination to build something from it and a world that was not making it easy. Rosa had told her the story with the calm, attentive directness of someone sharing information that is useful and true. And at the end of it, the young woman had said, with a bewilderment that was also its own kind of hope, "But you said you were not worth it." And then he stood up. "Yes," Rosa said, "and that changed things. The standing up changed some things," Rosa said. "But what changed most things was that I heard it." She paused. "When someone looks at you clearly, with the full knowledge of your circumstances and chooses you anyway, you have a choice. You can decide they are wrong, or you can decide that maybe the version of yourself they can see is the true one." She was quiet. "I decided to trust his eyes, and then, eventually, I learned to use my own." The young woman looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "How do you know which version is true?" Rosa Mercer Harding looked back at her with the dark, reading eyes that had been watching the world carefully for 41 years, eyes that had seen difficulty and dignity, and the ordinary miraculous work of a life built from nothing into something real. "The true version," she said, "is the one that is standing." Both, Eli would have told them if asked. It had been both. The simplest brave thing, standing up for the person who has just told you not to bother, disagreeing with a wrong verdict, choosing in front of every witness available to see someone clearly. The rest of it, the land, the house, the children, the accounts kept in a clean hand in a ledger that was never once falsified or mistaken. All of that had followed from one man rising from a corner table in the autumn of 1882, and a woman with dark eyes watching him do it, and something in both of them recognizing in that moment the shape of the life they were going to build.